Black teen is bullied at school. His therapist is afraid he may hurt himself. Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat in her neatly arranged office, surrounded by soft blue walls and framed motivational quotes. She took a moment to review the files of her newest patient, Jerome Parker. With years of experience as a mental health professional, particularly with marginalized communities, Dr. Mitchell had seen her fair share of troubled teens. However, Jerome's case stood out not only because of his academic potential, but also due to the severity of his struggles. Jerome, a 16-year-old Black student, had recently started therapy with Dr. Mitchell. His mother had reached out, concerned about his sudden withdrawal and declining grades. The school, predominantly white, seemed indifferent to the bullying Jerome faced. Dr. Mitchell knew that the environment in which Jerome lived was as much a part of his struggle as his internal battles. As the clock ticked closer to the start of Jerome's appointment, Dr. Mitchell made sure everything was in order. Her office, with its comfortable chairs and calming decor, was designed to make her patients feel at ease. She knew the first session was always the most challenging, especially with someone as reserved as Jerome. The door creaked open, and Jerome entered. He was tall for his age, with an air of quiet resilience that was shadowed by a deep sadness. His eyes avoided contact, focusing instead on a spot on the floor. His mother, a worried figure with tired eyes, gently nudged him forward before taking a seat in the waiting area. "Hello, Jerome," Dr. Mitchell greeted with a warm smile, hoping to convey her genuine concern. "I'm Dr. Mitchell, but you can call me Sarah if you'd like." Jerome nodded, his response barely audible. His body language spoke volumes. Arms crossed tightly, shoulders hunched, and averted eyes. Dr. Mitchell was accustomed to such behavior, understanding that it often masked deeper fears and anxieties. "Why don't you have a seat?" she suggested, gesturing to the comfortable chair opposite her desk. Jerome settled into the chair, still avoiding eye contact. Dr. Mitchell knew that building trust would take time. She decided to start with a softer approach, sharing a bit about herself to create a connection. "I became a therapist because I wanted to help people navigate through their struggles," she began, her voice gentle. "I've worked with many teenagers facing difficult situations, and I'm here to support you through whatever you're dealing with." Jerome remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Dr. Mitchell understood that silence could be a form of protection, a way of keeping the world at bay. She knew that pushing him too hard might only deepen his reluctance to open up. Instead, she chose to let him take the lead, speaking only when he was ready. Over the following sessions, Jerome's responses remained minimal. His answers were often short, and he seemed to withdraw further with each meeting. Dr. Mitchell tried various approaches, from discussing schoolwork to talking about his interests, but Jerome remained guarded. Despite this, she noted the small victories. A brief nod, a faint smile, or a few more words spoken each time. Dr. Mitchell's patience and persistence were crucial. She understood that breaking down Jerome's walls would require not just professional skill, but also empathy and understanding. She remained hopeful that, with time, he would find the courage to share his experiences and allow her to help him in meaningful ways. As the weeks progressed, Dr. Mitchell continued to build rapport with Jerome. She maintained a supportive presence, aware that every session was a step toward establishing a deeper connection. The challenge was to respect Jerome's pace while guiding him towards opening up about the issues he faced at school and at home. The weeks went by, and Dr. Mitchell's concern for Jerome grew. She had noticed subtle changes in his behavior, his reluctance to engage, his increasingly withdrawn demeanor, and his struggle with school. It was clear that something was deeply troubling him, but he wasn't ready to share. During a phone call with Jerome's mother, Mrs. Parker, Dr. Mitchell sought to gather more information. Mrs. Parker's voice was filled with worry and frustration. "Jerome used to be so vibrant and full of life," she said. "But ever since we moved here, he's changed. He barely talks to us anymore, and his grades are slipping." Dr. Mitchell listened attentively. "Has Jerome mentioned anything about his school experience? Any problems or incidents that might be affecting him?" Mrs. Parker hesitated. "He's been more closed off than usual. He's mentioned some issues with other students, but he doesn't go into details. I've noticed some bruises on his arms, but when I ask, he says he fell or bumped into something. The school hasn't been helpful." They say they need proof of the bullying to take action. Dr. Mitchell felt a surge of frustration and empathy. I understand how difficult this must be for you. It's important that we address this issue. I'll reach out to the school and see what can be done. In their next session, Dr. Mitchell broached the topic of school with Jerome. Jerome, your mom mentioned that your grades have been slipping and that you've been feeling more stressed lately. Is there something specific at school that's bothering you? Jerome's reaction was immediate. His shoulders tensed, and he shrugged, his eyes darting around the room. It's nothing, he mumbled. Just school. Dr. Mitchell pressed gently. Sometimes it helps to talk about what's going on. I know it's not easy, but sharing your experiences might make things a bit easier for you. Jerome's eyes were downcast. He was clearly struggling with the weight of his experiences. I don't want to talk about it, he said quietly. Dr. Mitchell respected his boundaries but remained determined. She knew that gaining his trust would take time, and she had to balance her approach to avoid pushing him away. She continued to offer support, hoping that one day he would feel safe enough to open up. Outside the therapy sessions, Dr. Mitchell began her efforts to address the bullying. She reached out to the school administration, requesting a meeting to discuss Jerome's situation. The school's indifference was disheartening, but Dr. Mitchell was prepared to advocate for her patient vigorously. The school officials seemed uninterested in addressing the issue, and their dismissive attitude was a stark reminder of the systemic problems that often compounded the struggles of marginalized students. Dr. Mitchell left the meeting feeling frustrated, but more determined than ever to find a solution for Jerome. It was a rainy afternoon when Jerome finally opened up. The soothing sound of rain against the window seemed to create a safe space, allowing him to lower his defenses. Dr. Mitchell sat across from him, ready to listen. I don't want to go to school anymore, Jerome said suddenly, his voice trembling. Dr. Mitchell's heart sank. Why not, Jerome? Can you tell me more about what's been happening at school? Jerome hesitated, tears welling up in his eyes. They hate me, he said, his voice cracking. They call me names, push me around, and make fun of me. They say I don't belong because I'm black. Dr. Mitchell's chest tightened with empathy and anger. No one should ever be treated like that. It's unacceptable, and you don't have to endure it alone. We're going to work through this together. Jerome's tears flowed freely now. I can't take it anymore. I just want it to end. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Jerome, I need you to promise me something. If you ever feel like you can't handle it, if you ever think about hurting yourself, you have to reach out. You can talk to me, your mom, or anyone you trust. Can you promise me that? Jerome nodded, his expression one of raw vulnerability. I promise. Dr. Mitchell placed a comforting hand on his. We'll fight this together, Jerome. I'll do everything I can to support you and ensure that you're safe. In the following sessions, Dr. Mitchell focused on helping Jerome develop coping strategies and building his confidence. They worked on identifying triggers and finding ways to address the bullying. Dr. Mitchell also began collaborating with Jerome's family to ensure they were involved in the process and supportive of his recovery. The breakthrough was significant, but Dr. Mitchell knew that the road ahead would be challenging. The bullying was not going to stop overnight, and Jerome would need continued support and advocacy to navigate the obstacles he faced. Despite the progress in their sessions, Jerome's distress began to manifest more intensely. He started showing signs of severe emotional distress, including expressions of hopelessness and thoughts of self-harm. Dr. Mitchell noticed the changes and knew they needed to act quickly. Jerome, you've mentioned feeling hopeless and having thoughts about hurting yourself, Dr. Mitchell said gently. These are serious concerns, and we need to address them together. It's important that you let me know what you're experiencing, so we can work on finding solutions. Jerome's eyes were filled with fear and sadness. I don't know how to stop the thoughts. They just keep coming. Dr. Mitchell decided to increase the frequency of their sessions. She wanted to provide Jerome with the additional support he needed during this critical time. She also reached out to the school once more, hoping for a more responsive approach to the bullying issue. However, the school administration remained dismissive. We haven't seen any concrete evidence of bullying, the principal said coldly. We can't take action without proof. If Jerome is struggling, he might need to work on coping strategies. Dr. Mitchell's frustration mounted. Jerome's experiences are valid, and the school has a responsibility to ensure his safety. Ignoring these issues won't make them disappear. We need to address the problem directly. Despite her efforts, the school remained uncooperative. Dr. Mitchell felt a growing sense of urgency to find alternative solutions for Jerome. She knew that the school's inaction could exacerbate his distress, and she needed to ensure that Jerome received the support he required. One day, Jerome missed a therapy session, and Dr. Mitchell's concern escalated. She tried calling his home, but there was no response. When she reached Mrs. Parker, the anxiety in her voice was palpable. "Jerome hasn't been home since this morning," Mrs. Parker said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." Dr. Mitchell's heart raced. "I'm coming over. We need to find him." When Dr. Mitchell arrived at Jerome's house, Mrs. Parker was pacing the floor, her worry evident. "I've called everyone he knows," she said, tears streaming down her face. "No one has seen him." Dr. Mitchell's concern was mounting. "We need to contact the police and start a search. Jerome's safety is our priority." They contacted the police, who quickly organized a search effort. Dr. Mitchell, Mrs. Parker, and Jerome's friends began scouring the neighborhood, visiting places Jerome might go to be alone. The search extended into the night, the growing darkness adding to their anxiety. Every corner of the neighborhood was checked, every possible location visited. Dr. Mitchell's worry was a constant weight on her shoulders, but she remained focused on finding Jerome. The search for Jerome continued through the night, and the uncertainty was palpable. Dr. Mitchell, accompanied by Mrs. Parker and a few of Jerome's friends, combed through the local park. The darkness seemed to amplify their fears, but they were determined to find him. "Jerome!" they called out repeatedly, their voices echoing through the empty park. "Jerome, if you can hear us, please come out." Hours passed with no sign of him. Dr. Mitchell's anxiety grew with each minute. She tried to stay calm for Mrs. Parker's sake, but inside, she was overwhelmed with fear for Jerome's safety. Just as the search seemed hopeless, a faint sound caught their attention. Dr. Mitchell's heart leaped as they hurried towards the source of the sound. There, sitting alone on a bench, was Jerome. His appearance was disheveled, and his posture was one of utter desolation. "Jerome!" Dr. Mitchell called out, rushing to his side. "Thank goodness we found you." Jerome looked up, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "I didn't know where else to go," he whispered. Dr. Mitchell knelt beside him, her voice soothing. "You're not alone. We're here for you, and we want to help. Let's go home, okay?" Jerome nodded weakly, and Dr. Mitchell helped him to his feet. As they made their way back, she reassured him of her continued support and the steps they would take to address the bullying and his emotional distress. The following day, Dr. Mitchell accompanied Jerome and his family to meet with a lawyer. They discussed the possibility of taking legal action against the school for their failure to protect Jerome. The lawyer, sympathetic to their situation, agreed to take on the case. Dr. Mitchell remained actively involved in supporting Jerome and his family throughout the legal process. The lawsuit was lengthy and complex, but it highlighted the critical need for schools to address bullying and protect their students. Jerome's experience and the legal action against the school began to have an impact. The case drew attention to the broader issue of racial bullying and prompted discussions about systemic changes needed within the educational system. With Dr. Mitchell's guidance, Jerome and his family made the decision to transfer him to a more inclusive school. The new environment was a significant improvement. Jerome quickly adapted, making new friends and seeing a marked improvement in his grades. The change of scenery provided him with a fresh start and a renewed sense of hope. Jerome continued therapy with Dr. Mitchell, who worked with him on rebuilding his self-esteem and developing healthier coping mechanisms. They focused on processing his past experiences and equipping him with skills to navigate future challenges. The legal action against the old school was a step towards broader change, inspiring other students to share their experiences and advocating for better policies and protections. Jerome's story became a beacon of resilience and the importance of addressing and combating bullying.